Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do the next step in our mixing pattern series, and we're going to focus on picking patterns based on colour. So if you're interested, please keep watching. I thought that I would start this video off with recapping what we did in part 1. And if you guys haven't seen that, I recommend going and watching that first. But just to summarise, we focused mainly on how to choose patterns based on their scale. So we looked at large to medium scale patterns, small patterns and solids. We looked at the magic formula, so that is one large to medium scale pattern, one small scale pattern and one solid. And we also looked a bit about how to pick solids, whether we wanted to use texture on our solid patterns, and how we can add more texture using embossed papers or coated papers that have maybe a glitter finish that add a bit of interest. And we also talked a little bit about using paper pads and collections, because the designer's already done the work and has picked the colours and patterns and scales that go together if they've done their job well, and they've presented that to you in a collection of papers. But we still need to do the work to make sure that we're picking out the right patterns from that paper collection based on the scale. Okay, so today we're going to focus more on colour, and specifically colour in relation to making sure that we have the right amount of contrast on our card. I'll probably do a separate video series on colour and different colour schemes and different colour tones, because it's quite an in-depth area and it would be too much to cover that as well as applying it to patterns in this video. It would just get really long. Okay, so again, in the previous video I showed a couple of examples of monochromatic or analogous colour schemes. So that means you bounce off the same colour, so maybe blue and white or black and white, or even black, white and yellow maybe. And we also looked at a couple of examples of analogous colour schemes, and that's, say, like this card here, where the blue and the teal are very close together on the colour wheel, so they all go together and they work in harmony. And you can see that I've got different shades of the blues and different shades of the teals, but they're all on that same side of the colour wheel. So when you're picking your patterns, it could be helpful to have a colour scheme in mind if you understand how to do that. Otherwise, I would recommend going to your paper collections and having a look through. So here we've got a nice bold pattern with lots of different colours, and there's some white space in between. Even though it's not white, it's actually a pale pink, and that's the neutral that she's used for this pattern. And then here we have quite a busy pattern, but there's more white space in between, and there's lots of different colours going on. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about what the main pattern would be. So in my previous video I used the term main pattern quite a lot, but I wanted to define it a little bit more. So your main pattern is usually the one in your scheme, so your scheme being the 3 that you've picked for your magic formula, that looks the busiest. So if one pattern isn't standing out as the busiest, then it might be because you have the scales wrong. So if you just take this one for example, and you compare the branding strip pattern to this, to me the branding strip could be the busiest one, or this one could be the busiest one. It's hard to tell. There's more white space between this than there is here, so there's more space covered by the pattern on this one. So for me, that would say this one would probably potentially be the main pattern. But then if I only had a small amount of this and a large amount of this one, then this one might be the busiest pattern. So it depends on the scale. So this is a large scale and this is probably a medium to small scale. But if I mix up the amounts I use, so if I use the most of this one and a small amount of this one, like in this example, then this would be my main pattern. So it depends on scale, but it also might depend on how much of it you're using and the colours involved. Now here the colours are very similar because I'm picking it from the same paper pack, so I wouldn't the colour wouldn't be my focus for fixing it here. It would be making sure the scales are right and changing up the amount of the patterns I use. In another example, it might be the colour that I need to fix. So I flicked through and I found this pattern, and I think that this was made by the designer so that you could punch out little elements like hearts and stars and things in each of the patterns, which is really cool. But she's paired it up in the branding strip with this blue pattern here, and in a small amount it actually reads okay. There's not a lot of contrast between these two patterns, but you could fix that with some edging, maybe like with an ink or framing it somehow. But when you flip over to the other side and you try and match this pattern here with a small amount of this pattern, it doesn't really read very well. And for me, the answer to this one is based on the colour, because if you look at the patterns in their entirety, so this one versus this one, actually let me just take this out. I was trying to have one paper pad that I didn't pull apart, but never mind. Anyway, if you read them next to each other, the pattern's actually the same. If you completely ignore the colour, the squares, okay, there's some longer ones here in rectangles, so she's mixed it up, but the formulation of the pattern is incredibly similar. So they kind of compete with each other. And it's mostly on colour, because my eye wants to look over here because it's really interesting. There's lots of colours going on and there's lots of separate patterns within the pattern. But my eye also wants to rest here because it's calmer and more neutral, even though it's still a pattern. This would be a great medium pattern if you've got a really busy multicoloured going on, but it doesn't work well with this particular multicoloured pattern, even though the designers paired them together. So that's what I meant before about, even though the designer's done some of the work for you, it doesn't necessarily always work with your card. You still have to work out your magic formula for your particular card based on the scale of the patterns that you've picked, the colour of them. And we're going to move on. Next lesson or part of the series is going to be about focus and how to use patterns to draw focus to what you want the person to see. The other reason why I'm not a big fan on this as a pattern, if I'm going to mix it with other patterns, is because there's so many patterns that I would have to find something that looked calm with, if that makes sense. This one looks like a bit of a nightmare, but it's actually, I quite like this. So if I was picking a solid for this one, if I wanted something to go with it, I would pick an orange or maybe a yellow. But if I had picked out my other pattern and then there wasn't enough contrast in it, then I would look to the blue as the contrast because there's less of it. Does that make sense? Because if I went dark and put a black border around this, then I think that would be too jarring because there's no dark elements in the pattern. The other thing you could do is use white as a matte to frame it, but you might not get the contrast you want depending on what kind of pattern you put in the background. So if you put this as your second pattern, white might be a good enough contrast, but it might look washed out. You'd have to play with your scheme and work out what works best for you. Okay, so we've looked a bit about busy patterns, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about quiet patterns. So that might be something that's really subtle. So I would say this is more of a solid because it reads as a wash of colour, as like a teal, but it technically changes, and so it technically is a pattern because it goes from very pale mint to a darker mint. So this would be a quiet pattern. I don't think in this collection there's actually a lot of quiet patterns. This could potentially be semi-quiet depending on what you had going on next to it. Because it's quite soft colour palette, they can read as quiet patterns sometimes. But as I said, it depends on what patterns you've got and what colours you've got next to it. This one's quiet in the sense that it could read as a solid, but it's still a bright colour. No, there's not a lot of quiet patterns in here. I would say this is a quiet pattern. There's lots of texture going on, but it's very soft. And it can be really tempting, especially when making shabby chic cards, to stick to all the pastel tones. And I think that's a beautiful look. But if your patterns just don't look quite right, it might be because there's not enough contrast. So a way you can still keep your pastel colour tone and make a pretty card and add contrast would be to maybe add a border in white. So then if you put this onto another similar tone, say this, you still have contrast. And it doesn't matter as well then that the colours aren't exactly the same. I mean, these are completely different styles, so I probably wouldn't mix a vintage with a geometric, but just because that's what I have to hand right now, you can see that if you lay them straight on top of each other, there's not a lot of contrast going on there. The only contrast is in the fact that there's a bit of busyness here and there is calmness here. And it's almost like your eye is drawn directly to this corner when that is not what we want to do, because usually our focal images is either to the centre or slightly off centre. So that for me wouldn't work. So that's kind of what I meant by too quiet, whereas this still pops. And it can be really subtle, it can be just the tiniest little border like that, or even smaller. But your brain needs to compartmentalise the patterns on the paper, and the best way to do that is either white space or to frame it. And then you can use your analogous or same colour repeated in different patterns, or your quieter patterns, and it still adds the contrast. I really hope this is making sense. It's so hard to explain what my eyes see because I'm not used to explaining what I see. I'm kind of more used to explaining what I do. I don't know. Hopefully this is helpful. And if you've got any questions, you can always leave them in the description box below. Oh, the other thing you could try is, if you didn't want to go lighter with the frame, you could do ink edging. So you could pick that darker blue from this pattern and edge it in this, and then you wouldn't know that this was a slightly different green to that. Or you could just pick a different corner of this paper pad which reads closer, and then you could edge it. Does that make sense? Hope so. I'm asking you. I know you can't reply like now when I'm recording, but you can when you're watching it back. So the next thing I want to talk about is mixing multicoloured patterns. So you can have more than one on your colour scheme. So for example, you could have this one and this one together. It's not my favourite, it's too busy for my taste, but you could do it because this one's very busy and its neutral is this sort of off-white, and it repeats the blues here that are in this pattern, and they seem like a similar theme. They look a bit like stitching, and this element here, this scribbling, looks a little bit similar to this one, so they technically work together. If you wanted to use these and you don't feel like they're working together for you, then I would swap out one of the patterns for something that has more neutral. So let's pick a different thing. This might be a good one because it's so crazy. So take these two together. No, that's got too much neutral in it. Okay, let's take these two together. So these technically, from a scale point of view, work. And from a colour point of view, they work because they've got the same colours in. And this is the larger scale, so from a scale they work, because these are large circles and these are smaller dashes. You can also change the way things go together by rotating the pattern. So for me, in this orientation, I don't like it as much as this orientation because there seems to be a nice flow. So if I was to use this one this way, I would also rotate this and use it that way. Hope that makes sense, although I still don't like that as much as the original one. And to make these work together in a scheme, I would use a contrast in solid. So I don't want to keep going back to this piece of paper, really. That's not enough contrast because the blue's too close to the edge. Let me grab a navy sheet of card. Or blue. Yep, definitely need navy. This might not work because I don't think it's dark enough navy. Nope, don't like it. So I'm going to try and pick a black instead because there is black in here. Yeah, that's better. So you could use these two patterns together when you pick your solid that is a neutral. And that usually saves my bacon quite a lot. And to be honest, I would probably map both the main pattern and the second pattern because they are so busy, and then it would help your eye see that they're different panels on your card. If you didn't like this, and because it's not your taste, it's too busy, you could swap out one pattern for one that has a neutral base like this one. And again, I would keep it going in the same direction because, well, you could mix it up, I suppose. I don't mind that quite as much, but I just prefer it that way for some reason. And you could use this pink colour as a neutral in this example. Because you have a neutral in your pattern, then your solid can be a colour and it not look too jarring. But if you want to step up the contrast, you could bring in the black again and have black as your neutral between your patterns. And that's another thing that I wanted to talk about, is sometimes your patterns technically look nice together, but because your eye can't separate them other than the line, you might need to give it a little bit of help, and one way to do that is adding in a border. And or you can use a frame, or you can ink the edges before you put them together, or you can layer a piece of ribbon over the top to create your border. You can literally do anything, but as long as you stick to the pattern scale rules, you should be okay. So like on this card, I've used quite a tightly knit pattern for both my busy pattern, like this would be my large scale pattern and this will probably be my medium. They read quite close together, maybe the other way around. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. But because they are both busy patterns, I've used this black solid as my border between the two patterns, and I haven't done this as a frame. It's not gone all the way around, but it's just a border on the edge, and then I've just repeated the same pattern in my embellishments there. I'm hoping this makes sense. I'm trying not to get off topic because there's so many elements of design and it's really hard just to focus on one thing without mentioning the balance of the other elements of the scale, the colour and focus, because they are so tightly knit together. And I'm trying to think of all the potential scenarios that you guys might get into when you're trying to match patterns, and I don't think that's physically possible. So if you are trying to mix patterns, you followed all the rules and it's not working for you, then I would be happy for you to email me a picture of what you're trying to do. My email is in the description box below and I'll try and help you out. Obviously if I get thousands of emails then I might struggle to answer you all, but I doubt that will happen, so I'll do my best. Okay, so going back to the need for a border or a frame, that is to have a place for our eye to rest, and that's really important because it's how our brain categorizes information. We need white space, as in nothing going on, blank space. It doesn't have to be literally white, although the brain does prefer it to be white, but in this case it's black. But our eyes need a place to rest when there's loads of stuff going on, otherwise we will get a headache and our eyes will be like ping, 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 and not know where to look. Which plays into the next lesson, which is going to be on focus. Okay, so I just want to summarise a little bit now. I think pattern papers can be super helpful for new crafters who don't have a lot of embellishments, and I think it can also be really intimidating if you are not shown how to use the patterns. I want to talk a bit about embellishments. So I know I keep going back to the same couple of cards, but they have so many sort of design points that work that they're just really good examples. Plus the fact if I had to make loads more, this videos would take me even longer to make. So I think that this card and the other Lady Bee card I made, where I made her into a ladybug, are really good examples of how I've mixed patterns in the embellishments and in the papers. So here, for my embellishments, I've mostly stuck with a solid colour. It's pretty hard to go wrong with embellishments when you commit to a solid colour. I've used all orange buttons here, and then I've changed this button to make it look like a flower by putting a pearl in the middle. So that works with the colour scheme. It draws your eye around, but it's not adding in another pattern or another colour. This one is adding in another pattern, but because the main part of the ribbon is black and there's only a small amount of white and it's going in the same direction as this pattern, I think it still works. And then I've just completed my visual triangle here with a yellow bow. And then on the background, I've just got literally simple white pearls because that brings in the frame, so it reads 1, 2, 3. I hope that makes sense. And then this one, I've used mostly silver embellishments, but they're in different textures. So this is a glitter strip and it's quite coarse, but it's coarse as in rough, and this has another texture, also lines, also going in the same direction, and it's a more 3D texture, if you know what I mean. That's more 2D, but again it's still going in the same line. And then I've got this softer twine here with a pattern. It's going on a different angle, but so is this piece down here, so it doesn't look out of place. And because I didn't have a black and white stripe anywhere else in this consistency on my card, I've added this little border here. The dashes kind of mimic it, but it's not close enough to read similar, whereas this little pattern here is. So I just wanted to show you a bit about adding embellishments to your pattern papers. This I just stuck it on because it was pretty, if I'm honest, but it's got a neutral background in the black and the silver is close, the gems are silver, so that's quite close to these two again. And I've got something shiny here and something really shiny here, and this is a more matte silver, so I still think there's some balance at the top of the card. And it's also balanced because it's the opposite corner of the silver down here. So just to close that bit, if you aren't confident mixing patterns with embellishments, then just focus on solid colour embellishments and mix up your textures, and then as you get more confidence you can bring in the embellishments that match your smaller patterns. And I say smaller because embellishments are normally a smaller scale, so you match your scale to the pattern. Okay, I know I've jumped a little bit around in terms of talking about scale and colour, but only when it was necessary to get the balance right between the two. And if you found anything confusing, leave me a comment down below and I'll try and get back to you. And as always, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. Bye! 50 awesome points to everybody who got this far in the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can find out when I release new videos. And there are a couple of videos here for your delectation if you so desire.